Hey, everybody. Welcome back. I am so glad that you're here for this episode of Communicate Like You Give a Damn. Now, we're really doubling down on language today with our guest, Carol. Carol, why don't you introduce yourself? And if you don't mind, I'd really like to just go straight into it.
Sure. Good afternoon. My name is Carol Velandia. I am a linguist, a social worker, and an entrepreneur, and also a flamenco dancer. And for the past almost 10 years, I have been working on the topic of language access. That's what I am most passionate about, and I hope we talk a lot about that today.
Absolutely. And it was based on our conversation that we had where I was just listening and saying, oh my gosh, more people need to understand language access and the impact that language has on a person's well-being is what you're all about. Some people hire translation services, et cetera, or even use like software and AI like Google Translate, but there's a nuance, a culture, nuance. There's the access that can, mean so much, a difference between night and day on an employee or a citizen's experience. And so the more and more we got into that conversation, I said, we just got to bring this conversation to this podcast. So thank you for recording, coming in from Spain. I believe you go back and forth between the US and Spain.
Yes, that's right. I am here for 3 months here in Spain, in the south of Spain, in Granada. I am learning flamenco dancing, which is another language. So I am very excited about it.
And I am coming off of my lots and lots of travels, and I've been doing so well in staying healthy and pounding echinacea and all the things. And some way, somehow, this very last trip that I'm having a break for 6 weeks before I travel again, and I caught something. So you get the lower registered voice, the smoky blues voice of Kim Clark today. All
Sounds
right,
great
with
to
that,
me.
yeah, you like that?
Yep.
All right, let's go. So the first question I have for you is, what is language access? Help people understand how it differentiates for other things, and why is it important today in today's multicultural and diverse societies?
Yes, language access simply means to provide the same level of access to services that you provide to an English speaker when you're working with a non English speaker. We probably don't hear about language based discrimination, but we are discriminating against multilingual communities every time we deny a service simply because they don't speak the dominant language. In our case, in the United States, that would be English. So, in a diverse society like ours, where we not only speak over 400 different languages, we also have approximately 26 million people that don't speak English at all. And they face worse outcomes across healthcare, education, legal services than the English speaking population. And that is why it's very important that we understand the concept of language access and that we make it relevant.
There's so much history with how we got to be having this conversation when companies started deciding that English would be the language of business as globalization started to expand. And many countries started teaching English as part of primary school or elementary school. And so many people born and raised outside of the US have more than one language, and English is one of them. And then you look at the US in particular and other mainly English speaking languages, and we are monolingual. And we are expecting everybody else to speak English, and that's a form of colonialism and all kinds of things. And so it's an interesting topic for us as communicators who are putting out communications at a global level, and trying to get to the point of communication. The point of communication for us as communicators, Carol, is connection. And
Correct.
this idea of language access is so overlooked and under-resourced, in my experience and in working with clients. So what are some of the common challenges or barriers that individuals face when seeking language access services, and how can they be overcome?
When you mentioned, for example, at the beginning, all these different technologies that we have and all these different mentalities that we have around language. So we have a lot of resources in a way, but we actually need a change of paradigm because, and I think that's the main challenge, because most people in the US have the mentality that we speak English in the US, which is obviously true, but the problem is that they also think that if you don't speak English, you are not worthy of receiving the services that they offer. So we don't have that multilingual mentality in the US. We think, for example, that English is our official language when we don't have an official language in the US. A lot of people don't know this. And also the United States has never been a multilingual country ever. Since the beginning of our history, we were multilingual. So trying to change that paradigm, not so much that we now believe that, okay, we're a multilingual community, but what to do with that is what's important. That's the challenge that we need to address, is how do we interact, how do we communicate with people that don't speak English? Because as you said, the main point is connection. So how do we go about that? So in the how is where we find the biggest challenge that people have, because we actually have the resources, the laws, and we're going to talk about that, but it's a change of mentality what I think we need to be seeking and achieving.
I love that. I love that. It's a paradigm. You're absolutely right. And that's a part of some of us as communicators, our bias. We just, we haven't been thinking about it from, unless we're really, really challenged and getting some pushback from some countries who are just like, this translation is, or you're not providing, access to us. When I'm working with Canadian clients, they always want to make sure that French Canadian is included. So that is very, very purposeful, but I'll go to other more global organizations and there won't be that request. There isn't any kind of function. Like, for example, just yesterday morning, I did a talk for Europe, and there was many, many countries that were in on that virtual workshop that I provided for the client. And the client is based in Amsterdam. And there was no conversation of any kind of translation services, captioning, those kinds of things. The expectation was that I speak English and they will receive it in English. There was actually no conversation about it. And I know enough to not talk too fast. In my high school French, my college French, and my high school Spanish, when I hear those languages spoken, if they're slower, I can understand more. And I've been given the feedback that as an English speaker, when there's multiple languages, to just slow down a beat, not go so fast. So that's something that we can think of as communicators as well, when there isn't the support. But this, in some situations, in some industries, when there isn't this language access, it's a matter of life or death in some situations. Let's talk about healthcare and education, legal systems. In what ways can language access services enhance inclusion and equality within these various sectors?
For example, in the healthcare system, communication again is the main diagnostic tool. So if we are going to have a patient that doesn't speak English and we don't provide a language access in the way of a professional interpreter, that person is more likely to suffer health related consequences and therefore worse outcomes. In fact, there is a 4% chance that a non-English speaker suffers severe temporary harm if they don't have language access than when compared to an English speaker. So that's one big consequence. In the legal field, for example, there is a large amount of wrongful convictions to people that don't speak English, simply because at the moment of the interrogation, they were not provided with an interpreter. Because, and this is one of the challenges, going back to your earlier question, people think that if you are nodding, you are understanding, for example, or if you speak 3 words in English, you are understanding, and that therefore they can release this very complicated questions, for example, in the case of a person being interrogated. And in education, of course, the way to look at it is that parents need to be participating in the children's education. So the children are going to learn the language, they're going to learn English. It is going to take a while, and the tools for those children that don't speak English are necessary, but also for the parents, so that they get involved with their education, and then the outcomes of the children are also better. And by the way, if I may mention, this is another really big challenge, is that we are using children to do professional work as interpreters, right? And that is one of the most ethical, the biggest ethical violations that we do today, is that we use children. Nobody would think that the US actually um, exploits children, right? That's not a conversation we even come across. But when you think about employing a child, and by the way, there are 11 million children that work today as interpreters. When we think about employing a child as an interpreter in such a complex environment like healthcare, for example, we're giving them a big responsibility that they are not qualified to do. We can possibly traumatize this child. So this is something that we definitely have to keep in mind when we think about all the different places where language access is key.
I really appreciate that you pointed that out, because we just take it for granted. I don't think we're really thoughtful in a lot of situations. I know when I was getting divorced, there was the option of Spanish speaking, and anybody asked in the galley, does anyone need Spanish? But it was only limited to Spanish speaking. There wasn't an opportunity to have various languages available. So I've seen it in that kind of legal setting, but it's not nearly enough. And and like we were saying, we're really depending on the wrong people to do the job for us, and need to be more thoughtful and strategic and forward thinking about this. So what are some forward thinking, innovative approaches or technologies that have been successful in improving language access for individuals with limited English proficiency?
Well, there is a ton of technology today that allows you to do, you know, machine translation, to interpret, for example, remotely. There is artificial intelligence that will help with that. But really, what I think is more innovative is that we start recognizing, going back to the basics, and recognizing the profession of interpreting and the profession of translating, because those tools that we have through AI and technology are not enough, or are not sufficient, unless there is a linguist behind it, because there are all sorts of potential errors that can occur if we just let a machine do that job. So there's a lot of innovation in the language field, and I'm not a tech person to really go into that, but suffice it to say that what really is innovative is how we approach this. How do we use this technology for the betterment of those people that don't speak English, right? For example, today, if you were to develop a really robust language access plan, you could offer technically 24/7 access to professional interpretation services, right? You could perhaps turn around a translation faster than before, a translation that has been reviewed by a linguist, right? And why can we do it faster? Because we can use um, methods to do to implement some automation with translation, for example. So the technology is there, the professionals are there. Is how do we connect this, and how we have that mind shift in terms of how we approach these professionals and this technology successfully and effectively.
I've been doing a number of webinars talking about AI and DEI communication. So, the text, the visuals, the videos, but especially the text. When you put something in like ChatGPT, for example, you'll see the bias, you'll see the sexism if you are skilled in DEI communications and know what to look for. For some of us, there can be an improvement of inclusive communications, but for the most part, I think AI is really reflecting to us because it's just taking what's already out there. That human element is absolutely critical in looking through this kind of language that's being spit. I think it's a mirror of like, crap, is that how we're talking about that? Is that what we're saying? And it's really missing the point. And we should really take that reflection very seriously and say, wow, we need to teach these data sets and teach ourselves on how to be more inclusive to avoid, the bias that is inherent in these data sets that's in AI right now. And so let me ask you about, let's just kind of level up and talk about some legislation. Like where is legislation and what role does it play in promoting language access? And are you aware of any specific laws or policies that have a significant impact?
Absolutely, and that's such an important question, Kim, because we talk about the civil rights and advocacy and all that, especially in the diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging space, and but we don't know about, for example, how the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act protect people that don't speak English. It says that nobody should be discriminated on the basis of race, sex, or national origin. And national origin is a proxy for language. So, in any kind of program that receives federal funding, they should have a language access plan, because they should not discriminate on the basis of national origin. And I think more and more people are raising their awareness about complaining when they are not receiving effective communication or interpretation services or translation services, and they can call that discrimination based on national origin. So Title VI is perhaps the biggest piece of legislation that we have. But there is also Executive Order 13166 that was signed by President Clinton in the 2000s, which also talks about meaningful access. So it tells organizations, again, that receive federal funding, how to create this language access plan or how to approach a language access plan. So, for example, if you are a hospital and you live in a community where a lot of people from China or a lot of Chinese speaking people live there, then it is likely that for you, hospital, because you are providing a critical service and the community that you serve speaks Chinese, is likely that for you, meaningful service means having uh, interpreters on staff that are Chinese interpreters, or that your documentation and signage is in Chinese, for example. Um, so that's what executive order helps with. It tells, for example, and the responsibility is different depending on the type of services that you provide. So if you are a zoo, for example, yes, you receive federal funds, but maybe the service that you're providing is not as critical as that of a hospital. So maybe for you, meaningful access means having all the brochures translated. So these are two very important pieces of legislation. But there is also some state legislation that address healthcare as well. And there is one that is the class standards. There is a culturally and linguistically appropriate standards that are specifically for healthcare, that tells you about how to provide effective language access, also how to consider the the proficiency of the professionals doing the language access, right? Because this is another issue, is that people tend to think they are fluent without ever having taken a test on their fluency on the other language, and they are like, oh yeah, no, this person understands because they are nodding, as I said earlier, or yeah, I speak enough French to get by. And class standards is very specific about this. It's like, you need to assess the language skills of the people serving the multilingual population. So these three pieces of um, legislation are key for people working in public services. But again, when we talk about courts, is a little different, and when we talk about schools, schools is a little different. But Title VI is the like umbrella piece of legislation that we have to keep in mind whenever we think about non-discriminating on the basis of language.
Okay. All right. Let's get into the ethics of language access. So, what are these ethical considerations that language access providers and organizations should be mindful of when we're
Very,
offering translation or interpretation services? Like, what are the questions that we ask? What do we need to look for, and what kind of feedback do we need to hear to make sure that we are creating that connection through language access?
the first thing really is to stop using children and family members to interpret for to make your job easier, right? If you are, and I see this over and over and over, professional lawyers telling me like, oh, I don't need to implement language access because the patient, the person, the client will come with their child and the child is bilingual and that is their language access plan. That is highly unethical for the reasons we explained before. They are minors. This is a professional work where, and we're basically underemploying this child, and also the type of vocabulary that they might be using could be quite complex. So that's the one thing, and I really would leave that as the main thing, because there are several ethical considerations, but that to me is the most important one. There was actually a film released a few weeks ago. I posted in LinkedIn on children working as interpreters, and I was baffled to know that this practice is rampant. So I think that if we achieve that, if we are able to remove children from the equation, we are going to be in very good shape to even open up to all the other ethical considerations that language access have.
I'm also thinking about sometimes when I've been in corporate environments, there's been a bias towards people who don't have English as their first language when it comes to equating that with less intelligence and other kinds of bias that can show up. When somebody comes from another country and they're a doctor in their country and they come here, but they're not able to be a doctor here, there's this assumption that there's a judgment because they don't know English. But you put me in the middle of Japan, I'm not going to be successful. And I may be judged for my intellectual value because I'm not able to speak the language there. There's a lot of impact and bias that plays into it. Just people with accents. There's reports that I've shared in some of the trainings and workshops when I work with clients, and is really talking about the bias of accents and how many people I have met who have forcibly removed their accent in the workplace in order to not have harassment, jokes, discrimination, because it becomes, while there's the diversity and there may be accents, or somebody doesn't have English as their first language, then it turns into a non-inclusive situation. And then it creates an inequitable situation where that person isn't necessarily understood as well. So they don't get the promotions, they don't get the new project, they don't get the kind of access and opportunities that somebody else does. So that's something that we really have to consider as colleagues when we're working with teammates and trying to find some more common ground and meeting people where they are. I often talk about inclusive communications, and when we are using inclusive communications, which should be standard in all of our communications, that we don't use acronyms, for example, or colloquialisms, within the United States that doesn't make sense to somebody that came from or is currently in South Korea. So we're leaving people out, and that's one part that as professional communicators we need to be thinking about as far as language access. Now let's talk about how language access actually relates to economic growth and development, both locally and globally. So how does language access services contribute?
Well, there is a plethora of answers to this, but of course, it would facilitate international trade because we have a globalized economy, and businesses are going to engage in cross-border transactions and negotiations where there is language access provided, right? And perhaps we don't have as much as a problem when there is commerce in the middle, because they always think about communicating effectively, and interpreters that work in that field, they don't have a shortage of work, right? So it's going to be, so the changes that we need to make there is just that in our local communities or in our smaller business, we could expand our businesses and make them grow if we were to translate our websites, if we were to offer language access as part of our daily routines. So we don't have to only accept or receive clients from the US. We can actually have clients from all over the world and that speaking all sorts of languages. I think I mentioned the story to you in a past conversation about how this lady told me, like, you know what, if somebody is going to come to my shop, they need to speak English. And I said, well, are you sure about that? Because your work might require that at some point you have language that you bridge the gap in the language. And she said, no, impossible. I don't think that's ever going to happen because I hire people that managers for large companies and all that. So I asked her, so if a company from Spain came to you and asked you, okay, you are really good about hiring the right talent, I need you to hire talent in Spain. So you couldn't say yes because you haven't planned for that. So you see what I mean? You can open yourself to a lot more opportunities if you open the language access speaker in a way. So you can also attract foreign investment, enhance, well, if you, for example, have a tourism company, if you have language access, for example, we actually have clients that in the tourism industry that connect to our 24/7 services because they want to attract people that not only speak English but speak a bunch of languages. So there are many, many ways to expand and grow economically with a successful language access plan.
Carol, I was working with a client who had a similar situation. They were trying to attract more diverse talent. They were being very intentional about that. And they realized that language was a barrier to attracting a talent that they needed and wanted. For example, they were starting to just do straight translation of their communications. They weren't taking into account the cultural nuance. They weren't taking into account context. And they weren't understanding at first that it's not a straight translation from English to whatever. Well, let's go back to South Korean. So Korean language, that it's not a one-to-one straight translation. There has to be nuance, there has to be context. For example, and it doesn't even have to be for employees who are located in other countries. It could be people who've come from those countries to the US that are now a part of your employee base, and they don't understand, they don't know. In this particular example, it was a client who was sharing health benefits, and it was about open enrollment, and how what they didn't take into account is that they don't actually, there's a part of their population that doesn't understand how healthcare works in the United States. It's different, in their country of origin. And so just straight saying, okay, here's open enrollment and here's what's going on, and communicating that was, it really harmed, parts of their employee population that didn't understand the context and the nuance of and understanding the cultural. So there needs to be that human element. There needs to be that kind of level of keeping in mind that the objective of communications is connection. And what will that take? And it's not always just the translation, but that, to your point, can bring in more of a diverse talent pool if we are very thoughtful and strategic and resource language access adequately. So I've got a couple more questions for you. What steps can individuals and communities and companies and organizations take to promote awareness and support for language access initiatives?
Well, before I just wanted to comment on something that you said that I think is very, very, very important, and that is the human element for connection. You will never replace humans when it comes to language, no matter how advanced the large language models are. I work in this industry, and that's the constant fear. And for over 30 years, we have seen that technology helps us advance and have more of translation and interpretation, but it's not replacing humans. And I don't think that's ever going to happen. It's going to perhaps make it more productive, etc. Now, answering to your questions, the steps that individuals, communities, and institutions can take to promote awareness. The first is educate and advocate. I think raising awareness about the importance of language access, it's key. There is a training, for example, that I offer, just changing the level of consciousness that you have around language access. So this educational piece is key. Then collaborating with language services providers, have them sort of as one a main provider that you have, right? If you're a company and you want to make sure that you are actually accessible and inclusive, and you have those diversity, equity, and inclusive policies, but to the people that you serve, then create a partnership with a language services provider. I think those two are, and then create policies internally. Okay, what do we do when the population that doesn't speak English approach our business? Because I think a lot of people or businesses don't even have this question, or they dismiss the few
Right.
times that people have approached them and they don't speak English. They're like, I don't know because I don't have enough of it. So create a language access policy internally to you. I think those are key elements.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And as a reminder, you don't have to be a global organization to have these language access policies. So there are trades that attract multilingual folks, and they could be domestic based. They could be US based, I should say. And so, so it's just look at your employee population and get a demographic understanding, get a psychographic understanding of what languages are spoken there, and you got to resource that. And I love the recommendation. You got to put a language access policy in place. And so when we're working on diversity, equity, and inclusion, whether we are US based or in English primarily based country, we don't have to be globalized in order to have this policy in place. When you're a global organization, 1,000%, you need to have this policy, and policies get funded. So I think that is such a huge point. And that brings us home to the question that I ask every guest. What does communicating like you give a damn sound like, look like, feel like when we're talking about language access? I think this is kind of a home run for you.
Well, if you are having any trouble understanding yourself, because remember that, and I have this tendency to speak Spanish, remember that language access is not only so that they access you, but that you access them. So if you really want to communicate like you've done, remember you are part of the equation as well. So if you are not understanding, right, be humble and request an interpreter yourself for your own sake. And that way you don't have to put the onus on the person that doesn't speak English, but perhaps they speak some English, but you prefer to speak in a language they can understand, and you also want to understand what they're trying to communicate. So get an interpreter for yourself. Change little points of your thinking to really expand it, I think. So if you want to communicate like you give Adam, consider yourself part of the equation. Get an interpreter for yourself as well when you need it.
Language access is core to diversity, equity, and inclusion communications. I can't stress that enough. So, Carol, what does your company do? What kind of services do you offer, and how can people find you, follow you, etc.?
Thank you, Kim. We provide a broad range of language services, including interpretation in over 200 languages, remote and in person, for conferences and for healthcare appointments, also for the legal appointments. And we also provide translation of documents in over 200 languages. We do transcreation, which is something very interesting. You, for example, write a story, a children's story that you want to convey in other countries with their cultural nuances. So somebody has to recreate it in that culture. And finally, I provide training to companies on language access. Companies that want to expand their knowledge in diversity, equity, and inclusion hire me to train their employees on language access specifically. And they can find me in www.equalaccesslanguageservices.com. So it's an easy name because we're all about equal access language services. It's a long name, but it defines what we do. And yes, we look forward to having people connecting and download our free resources. We have a ton of resources for free, like podcasts with information on the laws and regulations, and also written material on that they can simply download from our website.
Excellent. Carol, thank you for providing this service, and thank you for teaching us communicators what we need to be doing and prioritizing language access as part of our DEI work. Thank you so much,
Kim, for having me. I am really excited that we're working together, and yes, good luck with everything.
All right. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next time.
So, what popped out to you from the conversation? The more conscious communicators in the world, the better the world. So go to communicatelikeyougiveadamnpodcast.com and set up a one-on-one strategy session. And until next time, let's keep taking care of each other.